In a rare and heartwarming moment, President Ibrahim Traoré met legendary comedian and actor Eddie Murphy for the first time. What started as a lighthearted meeting quickly turned emotional when Traoré shared a deeply personal story that caught Murphy completely off guard. What followed stunned everyone in the room. Murphy was brought to tears by Traoré's words. This unforgettable encounter showcases how respect, sincerity, and unexpected vulnerability can create powerful human connections. The air in the quiet hotel conference room was filled with laughter when Eddie Murphy walked in. The legendary comedian had flown in for what he thought would be a lighthearted conversation with African leaders about the power of art and storytelling. Cameras were rolling, and the mood was cheerful. But sitting across from him was a man whose presence immediately shifted the room. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, young, humble, and calm, Traoré greeted Murphy with a warm handshake and a smile that felt disarmingly genuine. Eddie cracked a joke, and the room erupted in laughter. Yet Traoré's eyes carried a depth that silenced Murphy's chuckle mid-sentence. Then, without warning, Traoré leaned forward and said softly, "Do you know what it means to grow up with nothing, yet still have the responsibility to give everything?" The room froze. Eddie's smile faded. He wasn't expecting that. The cameras kept rolling. But for the first time in a long time, Eddie Murphy felt a lump in his throat. Something told him this wasn't going to be an ordinary meeting. President Traoré continued, his voice steady yet heavy with emotion. "When I was a boy," he began, "I watched my mother work from sunrise to sunset just so we could eat a small meal. She never complained. She only prayed that one day her children would live in a country where dignity was not a luxury, but a right." Eddie leaned forward, his usually playful expression replaced with one of deep concern. Traoré paused, then looked Eddie directly in the eyes. "Now, as president, I see the same children, barefoot, hungry, yet smiling. And I wonder, am I doing enough for them? Will history remember me as a leader who truly cared, or just another man in power?" The room was utterly silent. Even the camera crew seemed frozen, as though afraid to breathe too loudly. Eddie shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't comedy. This was raw truth. His heart tightened as he whispered, "Man, I didn't expect this." Traoré simply nodded. "Neither did I, but sometimes the truth cannot wait." Eddie Murphy tried to compose himself, but his voice cracked as he finally spoke. "You know, I've made the world laugh for decades, but hearing you, I feel like I've never asked myself the real questions. Have I done enough? Have I used my platform to truly help?" Traoré leaned closer, Eddie. "Laughter is healing, but beyond laughter, the world needs courage, and sometimes the courage to care can change lives more than jokes ever could." For the first time in his career, Eddie Murphy wiped tears on live camera. The room gasped. He whispered almost to himself, "You remind me of why God gave me this gift, not just to entertain, but to serve." Traoré placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then maybe today is not just a meeting. Maybe it's the start of something bigger." Those words pierced Eddie's heart. He wasn't the only one crying now. Many in the room, even the camera crew, had tears streaming down their faces. The world had just witnessed the first crack in Eddie Murphy's legendary smile. And it wasn't weakness, it was humanity. The laughter that once filled the room now felt like a distant memory. Eddie Murphy sat still, his usual grin gone, listening intently as President Traoré's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Traoré's calm voice carried a weight that no one could ignore. "I didn't come here to impress you, Eddie," he said. Softly, "I came here to share the truth of my people, the truth the world too often chooses to forget." Eddie swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. He tried to lighten the mood with a smile, but it wouldn't come. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every flicker of emotion. Traoré continued, "Every morning I see children on the streets with dreams bigger than their meals. And every night I ask myself, what more can I do to make sure they have it tomorrow? Worth waking up to." The silence was deafening. Even the sound crew shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time in years, Eddie Murphy wasn't the man commanding the room. He was the one being moved. Eddie leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice, usually so full of energy, was barely above a whisper. "You know, man, I've been blessed beyond measure. I've made people laugh when they thought they couldn't smile again. But hearing you, It makes me wonder if I've truly done enough. Have I given back the way I should? TR's eyes softened. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he placed a hand on his chest. The measure of a man is not in what he keeps, Eddie, but in what he gives. And giving doesn't always mean wealth. It means heart, presence, and courage. Eddie bit his lip, fighting back tears. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the rawness of a moment no one had expected. "Brother Eddie," whispered, "I feel like you just touched something I've been ignoring for years." Traoré nodded. Sometimes the truth waits quietly until we're ready to hear it. The crowd, though silent, felt an almost electric pull, like they were witnessing history, not an interview. The weight of the moment became too much for Eddie Murphy. He dropped his head into his hands, and for the first time in decades, tears streamed down his face in front of an audience. The room collectively gasped, but no one moved. President Traoré leaned closer, his voice gentle. "Do not be ashamed of your tears, Eddie. They are proof that your heart is still alive." Eddie raised his head slowly, his face wet, but his spirit touched. "Man, I came here thinking I'd be the one bringing laughter, but you've given me something far deeper. You've reminded me what it means to be human." Traoré smiled faintly, and perhaps this is the moment when laughter and truth meet, not to entertain, but to heal. Even the cameramen had tears in their eyes. What was supposed to be a cheerful meeting had turned into a once-in-a-lifetime exchange of truth and vulnerability. It wasn't just Eddie who felt changed. Everyone in that room would leave, different than when they walked in, and the world watching from afar had no idea what was coming next. The audience sat frozen, unsure if they should clap, cry, or simply stay silent. Eddie Murphy wiped his eyes, clearly struggling to keep his emotions in check. President Ibrahim Traoré took a deep breath and leaned back slightly, his eyes steady yet soft. "Eddie," he began, "I want to tell you something I have never shared in a room like this." The crowd leaned forward, as if one body. "When I was a young man," Traoré said quietly, "I stood in a village where children lined up, not for toys, not for the school, but for a single piece of bread. I remember their eyes. Not one of them complained. They simply waited, believing that somehow tomorrow would be better." Eddie's lips trembled. The cameras caught every flicker of emotion on his face. Traoré paused. "That day I promised myself I would never allow the world to forget those eyes. And every decision I make as a leader, every sacrifice, it is for those children who still wait." The room was completely still. Even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. Eddie finally found his voice, though it shook. "Man, you don't even know what you just did to me. I came here thinking we'd laugh, maybe joke a little. But you just went straight to my soul." He looked down, covering his face with his hand, then looked back up at Traoré. "I've spent my life making the world laugh, but laughter doesn't feed a child. It doesn't give hope to the hungry. Listening to you, it makes me realize I've got more to do." Traoré reached over, gently, resting his hand on Eddie's shoulder. "You've given the world joy, Eddie. That is no small thing. But perhaps now, your laughter can also light a path towards something greater." The audience began to sniffle, tissues quietly rustling. Eddie's voice cracked. "Brother, I didn't expect to cry today." Traoré smiled faintly. Sometimes tears are the only language the heart understands. The cameraman's lens zoomed in, capturing a tear sliding down Eddie's cheek, an image that would later circle the globe. Word of the moment spread instantly. Clips were uploaded online before the program even ended. Within minutes, hashtags filled social media: Traoré and Murphy, tears of truth, human connection. But in that studio, none of them were thinking about fame or virality. They were simply two men, one a comedian, the other a president, connected by raw honesty. Traoré looked into Eddie's eyes. "What matters most is not the positions we hold or the applause we receive. It is whether we leave behind a world better than the one we found." Eddie nodded slowly, his tears now flowing freely. "You've just changed me, man. You've really changed me." The studio audience erupted into applause, not the kind for a joke, but the kind that comes from being deeply moved. Some stood, others wiped their eyes. Traoré remained calm, almost serene, as if he knew the world was witnessing more than a conversation. It was witnessing a seed of hope being planted. And outside that studio, millions were already being touched in ways they could never have imagined. The air in the studio was heavy, with silence broken only by the soft hum of the cameras. President Traoré lowered his gaze for a moment, as if gathering strength from a memory etched deep within him. "When I was a boy," he said softly, "I watched my own mother give up her share of food so that I could eat. She smiled at me that night, though she had nothing for herself. That image never left me." Eddie's eyes welled up instantly. He pressed a hand against his chest, whispering, "Man, that's love. That's sacrifice," Traoré continued. "Today, when I lead my people, I ask myself, am I giving enough? Am I first sacrificing? Enough. Because real leadership isn't about power. It's about love strong enough to endure pain." The audience shifted uneasily in their seats, their emotions unraveling. A few tears slipped down the faces of strangers who had come expecting laughter, not heartbreak. Eddie shook his head slowly, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Brother, that's the kind of truth the world doesn't hear enough." The room stayed hushed, as if afraid to break the sacredness of the moment. Eddie leaned forward, his voice trembling. "You know, I've played roles my whole life. I've made people laugh. I've made them forget their troubles for a while. But hearing you now, I feel like I've been running from something real." Trey watched him with calm, compassionate eyes. "What are you running from, Eddie?" The question hit harder than expected. Eddie blinked rapidly, trying to stop the tears. "I grew up poor, too. There were nights my mom worked 3 jobs and still couldn't pay the bills. I used laughter as my shield. But deep inside, I was always that little boy wishing he could do more for her." The audience gasped softly, some clasping their hands together. Eddie had never been this vulnerable in public. Trop reached across, gently taking Eddie's hand. "You already honor her every time you bring joy to others. But now, maybe it's time to use that gift not only for laughter, but for change." Eddie's shoulders shook as he nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in years, the comedian wasn't the one making others cry. He was crying with them. By now, phones across the studio were buzzing as live clips flooded the internet. Hashtags surged: Murphy and Traoré, tears of hope, real leadership. But inside the studio, none of that mattered. The connection between these two men had become bigger than the cameras. Traoré spoke again, his tone steady, his words deliberate. "The world may think strength is shown in how loudly you speak or how much wealth you display, but I tell you, true strength is the courage to remain human in a world that tries to make you forget your humanity." Eddie lifted his head, his face stirred with tears. "I feel that, man. I feel that deep." The audience rose to their feet, applauding. Through their own tears, some clutched their chests, others held hands with strangers beside them. One young man in the audience whispered, "I came here for a comedy show taping, but I'm leaving with my heart changed." The camera zoomed in on Eddie and Traoré, both visibly emotional, both united in a moment the world would never forget. It wasn't just television anymore, it was history in the making. The applause eventually faded, leaving the room wrapped in silence. No one dared break it. Eddie sat with his face buried in his hands, his shoulders trembling. He wasn't the legendary comedian anymore. He was just a man stripped of his armor. President Traoré leaned closer, his voice low but firm. "Eddie, the world sees your laughter, but today they also see your heart. And I promise you, showing your heart is not weakness. It's the highest form of courage." Eddie looked up slowly, tears glistening in his eyes. "You know, I never thought I'd cry like this in front of millions of people. But something about your words, they hit a place I've kept locked for years." Traoré gave a gentle nod. Maybe the lock was waiting for the right key. The audience erupted. Again, not in wild cheers, but in a slow, steady clap that carried weight. The kind of applause that said, "We understand." Eddie exhaled, almost as if a burden had been lifted. For the first time in decades, he felt truly seen, not for his fame, but for his soul. As the studio lights dimmed slightly, Traoré leaned back in his chair. "There's something I must share with you, Eddie. When I was 15, I stood in a crowd of hungry children. A stranger gave us 1 loaf of bread to share among 20. I tore a piece so small I could hardly taste it. Yet, I told myself, if I survive this, I will make sure no child ever feels this hunger again." Eddie's lips parted slightly, his breath shaky. Man, I felt hunger too. Different place, same pain. Traoré looked at him deeply. Pain may come in many forms, but it unites us, and when we share it, we turn pain into power. A woman in the audience sobbed quietly, clutching her chest. Even the cameraman's eyes glistened. Eddie wiped his face and whispered, "You know what's crazy? You're a president, I'm a comedian, and yet we're sitting here realizing we've walked through the same shadows." Trey smiled faintly. Titles don't matter, Eddie. Hearts do. Fell still again. Millions watching online were already calling it the most human interview ever. By the time the host tried to wrap up the segment, no one wanted it to end. The air was thick with emotion, raw, unfiltered, unforgettable. Eddie turned toward the cameras, his voice cracking. "You know, people watch me to laugh. But tonight I want you all to feel, because this man right here," he gestured to Trey, "reminded me that laughter is beautiful. But truth can change lives." Trey placed a hand over his heart. "And your laughter, Eddie, is also truth. You heal souls in ways you may never fully see. Don't underestimate that gift." The crowd stood again, this time in a standing ovation so powerful it echoed beyond the studio walls. Phones worldwide buzzed with live comments. "I'm crying like a baby. This is history. I'll never forget this night." Eddie wiped his tears and whispered, "Thank you, brother. Thank you for reminding me of who I really am." Traoré simply replied, "We reminded each other." And at that moment, it was no longer just an interview. It was a bridge between two souls witnessed by the world. As the camera zoomed in, you could feel the world holding its breath. Eddie Murphy sat quietly, his eyes red, his voice trembling. He leaned toward Traoré. "You know, I came here expecting laughs, some lighthearted talk, but what you gave me, brother, you gave me healing." President Traoré lowered his head humbly. "Eddie, healing belongs to all of us. Sometimes it only takes one heart, speaking truth, for another to find peace." The studio was silent, except for muffled sobs from the audience. Even viewers at home admitted later that they cried so hard they forgot they were watching TV. For a long moment, Eddie and Traoré simply held each other's gaze. No script, no politics, no performance. Just two men baring their souls in front of millions. The host, visibly moved, whispered, This is not just an interview. This is history." And she was right. Traoré then shared something no one expected. "Eddie, there was a time I thought I had nothing left. My people were struggling. My country weighed on my shoulders, and I was afraid I might fail them. But one night I heard laughter. Children laughing in the middle of hardship. That laughter reminded me why I must keep fighting." Eddie's tears flowed freely now. He placed a hand on Traoré's shoulder. "That's the same laughter I've tried to bring to people my whole life, but I never thought of it that way. That laughter could be resistance, hope, survival." The audience erupted in another wave of applause, many wiping away tears. Social media was already exploding with clips. Eddie Murphy meets his match in sincerity. President Traoré proves leaders can touch souls. Eddie whispered, "You just changed how I see myself." Traoré smiled softly. "And you just reminded me why we must never stop sharing light, even in the darkest nights." For once, the comedian who always had words was left speechless, only able to nod as the tears kept coming. The host finally stood, her voice breaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have all witnessed something tonight that cannot be staged. President Ibrahim Traoré and Eddie Murphy have shown us the power of truth, respect, and human connection." Eddie wiped his face and turned to the cameras. "If you're watching this right now, don't just watch. Feel it, share it, tell someone you love them today. Don't wait." Traoré placed a hand over his heart. The world changes not by speeches, but by moments. Like this, when we dare to be human. The studio audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause, many crying openly. Online, millions posted messages. "I'm sobbing uncontrollably. This broke me in the best way. Traoré is the kind of leader the world needs." As the lights dimmed, Eddie embraced Traoré tightly. "Thank you, brother. Tonight, you didn't just touch my heart, you healed it." And with that, the unforgettable meeting ended. Not with jokes, not with politics, but with a silence so powerful it echoed around the globe. Before you leave this story, I need you to do something important. If this moment touched your heart, if you felt the tears fall as you listened, then please subscribe, like, and drop a comment below, sharing what part of this story moved you most. Your words matter. Your support spreads these powerful truths further. Let's make the world feel this together.